So let's start out by talking about Catholic education. It's definitely not now what it used to be like 50 years ago. And what it was like 50 years ago wasn't what it was like 100 years ago. There have been some amazing changes. There have been a lot of schools opened in the last 100 years and a lot of schools closed in the last 100 years. And why has that been the case? Well, it has to do with some of the developments that were going on within the American Catholic Church. A lot of these are demographic. One of the things that was being, worried about was how to carry out Americanization within Catholic schools. Catholic schools develop into an entire network, an entire system that provides an alternative to what? Where would you go if you weren't going to Catholic school, if you were a Catholic kid? The mines? Hang out on the corner? They'd put you in public school. Why did Catholics need to have their own schools? Yeah?
Probably not welcomed in public schools, lots of bullying.
Actually, they really wanted to get as many Catholic kids non-Catholics wanted to get as many Catholic kids as possible into public schools so that they could do something important with them. Yeah.
But I would think parents sent their kids to Catholic schools so they could learn about their religion and what it means to be Christian. Cause
yeah.
It's not allowed to be taught in public school.
Now notice, it's not allowed to be taught today in public schools. Although actually you can teach about religion in public schools. The Supreme Court distinguishes between teaching religion and teaching about religion. Back at the time that Catholic schools became a going concern, they were teaching about religion in schools, but they were teaching about it from the Protestant perspective. So the King James Bible might actually be a textbook in many classes. There were other, textbooks that they were using, about, say, American history, where Catholics would be either left out or, demonized. Also Mormons, also, other groups as well. Not to mention, atheists, those dirty atheists, for a long time. So they wanted to be an alternative to the public school system because the public school system was felt to be anti-Catholic. They wanted to get as many of these kids not into Catholic schools, but into public schools so that they can get the Catholicism out of them. That was the view of many of the educational reformers of the time, whether Protestant or secular. So the Catholic school systems develop, and they end up doing a couple really important things. One is, they do end up, educating, of course, providing a lot of people a decent education. Nowadays we tend to associate Catholic schools with excellence, but that's more, I would say, a mark of how public schools have declined than bless you, Catholic schools being, super great, although there are some, stellar Catholic schools. So they educate, they also carry out something that we might call a standard experience. And your book talks in this term about the Catholic Ghetto. And they don't mean it in a pejorative term, like when we say that something is ghetto, meaning that it's sort of made up on the spot, or not as good, it's a knockoff, or things like that. That's a very contemporary term. And they don't mean it necessarily in the sense of slums, although a lot of Catholics did live in pretty bad neighborhoods. My mom had some interesting stories about what it was like growing up in Chicago poor. What it meant by talking about ghetto was that the Catholics had their own sets of institutions, in large part, centered around the Catholic schools, which would provide a kind of world. One Catholic commentator talks about what it was like back then. And that's even before my generation, or even some of your grandparents' generation. You said you would just talk about the Catholic experience as, here comes everybody. Because everybody that you would know on your block would probably be Catholic, or the odd Protestant or Jew or freethinker. And you probably all went to the same school and tended to come to think and see the world in the same ways. Like your book says, there's reasons for this. The middle decades of the 19th century were dominated by the need for rapid expansion of the school systems to accommodate the flood tide of Catholic immigration. So what happens when you expand something very quickly? We often want to think that promotes a lot of creativity, and the more institutions you have, wow, the more diversity of thought you're going to have. Everybody can find their niche. Is that really the case? More often it does lead to a kind of standardization, a kind of leveling. Everybody ends up seeing things the same way. So your book talks about that as being a key thing. It became required by the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore that every school system, there we go, organizational alternative. Every parish had to provide a Catholic school. So this really made parishes important, central to the experience. That's not the case anymore, is it? That every parish has its own school. The Catholic schools in this area they underwent another sort of assessment of which ones ought to close. It's about a year ago. Some of them made the cut, some of them didn't. The ones that didn't, they protested, but then they got closed. Why did they do that? Well, because there wasn't enough population to support them. They're drawing resources away from the diocese. This was the opposite of that. In this case, they were saying, if you have a parish, you have to have a school because you've got to have some way of providing all this to those kids that all those parents, those church-going parents, are making and putting into your midst. And so your book talks about the role of the parish, and it talks about what they call paraliturgical activity. What they mean by this is that the parish becomes a center for all sorts of things besides the Mass, all sorts of other devotions and organizations and clubs. What are the sort of organizations today? There's very few that have survived. Certainly very few that are attracting the young. What are the sort of organizations you associate with Catholics? And not with priests or nuns, but with, ordinary Joes and Josephines engaged in sort of Catholic life. Who are the people who put on the fish fries, for example? It's not the priest out there, flipping baskets of fish, making fries, handing out the plates. They might put in some time, but they're pretty busy. There's not enough priests currently, so a lot of them have to do 2 or 3 parishes. Who are the people that are doing these sort of volunteer activities? Knights of Columbus. Yeah, now the Knights of Columbus would be an example of what they're talking about as a, parish-based, and that's a bigger organization, but it's parish-based. You know the guys in your group. They recruit from within the parish. There's all sorts of organizations like that once you scratch the surface. Many of them are pretty old, and old in the sense that they have many older members than in comparison to younger. Other organizations would be, athletic organizations, literary organizations. If you want to, for example, Chesterton is an important Catholic writer. There's a Chesterton Society that meets here in Poughkeepsie. I've never gone. I'm a big Chesterton fan, but the schedule never makes it. But there are people who meet together, And not all of them are necessarily Catholic, but you can bet that most of them will be. And it's probably going to be hosted by a parish. They talk about a lot of observances like novenas, exposition of the host, saying the rosary, all these sorts of things, people getting together to do that. That's all part of this big, totalizing parish life that they're referring to. Now, your book also talks about what supported this. The emphasis on devotional piety and ecclesiastical authority continues in an extensive and centralized institutional network in which Catholic schools play a rapidly growing role. This is what they talk about as ghetto culture. Ghetto, again, because it tends to isolate Catholics. It tends to become its own sort of separate world. So Catholics may engage with non-Catholics, say in the marketplace, or where else? In work, in the army. But for the most part, the people that they know and associate with are going to be other Catholics. One cost of this was what one commentator's called the dirty little secret of pre-Vatican II Catholicism, an imposed uniformity of thought and practice. I'm going to skip on a little bit. Your book does also talk about film, which, if we're going to talk about culture, what role did Catholics have in film? Anybody sort of a film buff, knows their film history? You know that rating system that they have on films? It's not really followed much anymore because you can watch whatever you want, like on Netflix or things like that, right? But you have, G. Anybody can go to a G movie. PG. Pretty much anyone can go to a PG movie too. PG-13. R. R is sort of the big dividing line, right? You're not supposed to be able to go into an R movie if you're like under 17 unless you're, accompanied by a parent or a guardian or whatever. And then X, that's the dirty stuff, Definitely got to be, or now it's NC, 17. What's all that about? How did that happen? That's not the beginning of the code. The code developed over time. Catholics had a major part in that. If you ever watch what they call pre-code Hollywood movies, they were pretty racy. People came up with some wild stuff in the 20s. And Catholics reacted against that. If Protestants were the ones who were driving prohibition, Catholics were the ones who were primarily driving, having some sort of restriction system for the movies, trying to make the movies more wholesome, less about all these other dirty, perverse, violent things. So there's on the one hand a kind of restrictiveness. On the other hand, there's also a lot of involvement of Catholics in the movie business. And there's this emergence of the new film genre with a book called The Hero Priest. Catholic priests were now depicted uniformly, not only as morally flawless, but as handsome, affable, muscular, and even, in the case of Bing Crosby, as musical. He did a lot of, movies like that. So you got these two sides, and these continued until about the 1960s. Again, what happens in the 1960s? What happens in film in the 1960s and 70s? Nobody's a film buff here? Nobody's really into movies? The genre of horror movies, for example, flourishes. You would not see The Exorcist, which is a 1970s movie, being done in 1940 or 1950. That's something that happens after that. What else? Other realms of cultural and intellectual life. What we see leading up to Vatican II, and then definitely after Vatican II, is a kind of opening up, a flowering of Catholic culture, Catholic intellectual life. Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Francis Mauriac, those are Those are some key novelists. If you haven't read people like Green and Waugh, you ought to. They're great writers. And if you want to, if you want to see what these people were actually thinking about, the sort of themes that they were focused on, they're as relevant today as they were back then. Flannery O'Connor, I think probably quite a few of you probably read her, or at least a story by her in your high school lit classes. She was a Southern Catholic. You start seeing a lot of other things happening in philosophy, in theology, in plays, in literature. And there's also a lot of people within those groups who are very critical of the institutional Catholic Church. Graham Greene is a great example of that. Catholic education undergoes some major transformations beginning in the 60s. So what changes? Again, demography really drives this. What happens to people when they become more affluent? Do they have more kids or less kids? As their fortunes increase. Yeah.
Generally less kids.
And why? Less time to have sex? Is that it?
Usually depends on the woman. If she gets more education, she usually delays having her first child.
That's a big thing right there, yeah. So children are born later, fewer of them. If you don't want to, children actually cost quite a bit of money. So one way to not be poor is don't have a whole bunch of kids. Just that by itself will actually tend to boost things. But there were other things going on too. Birth control in the form of the contraceptive pill became widely available in the 1960s. And that dramatically affected birth rates. Now, if you have all these Catholic schools that you built all over the place, and you don't have more Catholic kids being born, you have some, but it's not growing and growing and growing, what happens? Well, you can't have all those schools. You can have all those kids in schools, but you don't need quite so many. You can add to that, too, that from the 1960s on, we've seen a dramatic drop in vocations, at least in the United States, to these orders that carried on a lot of the work. In Catholic schools, I'll put it to you this way. When I'm 20 years older than all of you. When I was in Catholic school in high school, the nuns that we had were all old, and some of them died while I was in school. Doesn't sound nice, I know, but it's a fact, Why was that happening? Because they were the ones who were actually doing the teaching. They weren't getting new nuns. There were very few young nuns. I think the youngest one was probably 60. Now that was in my generation. For Catholic schools in your generation, it's almost all lay teachers. Most of our teachers were what we call lay teachers. That means non-religious. We had a few priests, a bunch of nuns, and fewer when I left than when I came in. In the previous generation, they still had quite a few of the younger ones, but they weren't getting a lot of replacements. Now, what's the best thing about having nuns from an institutional perspective? If you're the one running the school, what's the best thing about having nuns or monks or priests teaching? Yeah.
They have more emphasis on the religion.
Well,
they encourage you to
hopefully.
rise prayers.
There's some horror stories, about how mean the nuns were, and some of them are actually true. So it's not that. Although you would hope that's the case, right? Think about it in purely economic terms. Yeah.
You don't have to pay them?
Yeah, or you can pay them very, very little. That's part of what allowed a lot of Catholic schools to be able to offer a wide, range to a lot of different students. The fact that they had a labor source that, because they had this religious vocation, would be involved in that. Lay teachers in Catholic schools still, in general, make less than public school teachers. But they make a lot more than nothing. And so that makes it harder to keep schools open as well. Your book talks about the abandonment of many inner-city parishes. Many parochial schools lacked their traditional demographic base. As neighborhoods changed to become less and less Catholic, a lot of Catholic schools felt, well, what are we doing here? And interestingly, in the inner cities, the majority of the students in Catholic schools are not Catholic. What are they? Who's sending their kids to Catholic schools if they're not Catholic? Yeah.
A lot of cases, families who don't want to send their children to public school will send them to a Catholic school because its tuition's cheaper.
Yeah, and we're back to, it's an alternative to the public schools. So it's used in particular in poor neighborhoods by African American students whose parents like the fact that Catholic schools have, say, dress codes, discipline, good academic standards, in comparison to some of the other local schools. So that's a major change as well. Your book then sort of brings things to a close by going back again to talk about intellectual life. And they chart out this process, and this is kind of a good place to finish up. In the time before Vatican II, there was this opening before Vatican II happened towards greater intellectual investigation, towards recovering what was there. It says, enhanced historical consciousness began to emerge as Catholic resources increased substantially. So Gothic revival architecture would be a visible form of this. Gregorian chant coming back and singing, probably not something that's easy to relate to. Pontifical institutes of medieval studies, neo-Thomism, all of that. Focus on the medieval in that case, and a very sort of truncated version of the medieval. After Vatican II happens, after there's this emphasis on going back to the sources, Catholic scholarship just opens up and becomes a major force on the intellectual scene. In part because they're going back to all these, church figures that had often been neglected. Say Augustine, as opposed to Thomas Aquinas. There is the founding of the Catholic Biblical Association of America. American Catholic biblical scholars begin to be taken seriously, not just by Catholics, but by Protestants. And this is how we reach the sort of state we are at today, where you have, major research institutions, which are Catholic institutions, like, Notre Dame, like Georgetown. Some people would say that they've lost their Catholic identity, but there's still, a lot of people there who are working in a distinctively Catholic mode, who are focused on, this pretty broad history. And it's fertilized Protestant scholarship, which it's also drawn upon. There's been a lot of, remember we talked about ecumenicism and dialogue? That happens at a scholarly level in terms of thought and culture, as well as just getting together with people from different religions and shooting the breeze. So that's a good place, I think, to bring our story of the Catholics pretty much to a close.